Exit algorithms. Scale smarter. Sell stronger.
Welcome to Exit Algorithms, the podcast where we decode what it really takes to unlock growth, streamline operations, and prepare your business for a high-value exit. I'm your host, Pete Vera, and today I'm joined by Wayne Marhelski. He's a private equity operating executive with 4 successful portfolio company turnarounds under his belt. He's a U.S. Air Force veteran and 3-decade operations leader who specializes in turning operational complexity into real EBITDA. Wayne, is super excited to have you here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Can you share for listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and maybe some of your career highlights?
Sure. So, I started right out of high school going into the military, which for me was a great choice. It kind of opened the door to the world of manufacturing. After my tech school, I was fortunate enough to be stationed in Japan for 3 years. And as part of that, I was voluntold how I was going to become a trainer on TQM for the squadron, which, I've never turned down free training. And so, part of that free training was, hey, you get to go visit Toyota and see how Toyota and other companies in Japan adopted all of Deming's philosophies. And, what resonated for me, with going into Toyota, not having a lot of knowledge as far as the Japanese language, is that it still made sense, and that was like my big takeaway. Like just walking out on the floor, I had a sense of how the material was moving, where it was going, where it was coming from. And that's always kind of resonated with me. So, even as I exited the Air Force and was going to, school, and then eventually, stepping into manufacturing, it was something that really always kind of stayed with me is, we may make complex products, but it doesn't need to, mean that we have to be doing it in a very complex way. Like we should always look for simplicity. So, I've experienced some recessions, in my career, from the telecom industry to the Great Recession, in 2008. Done some turnarounds on the way, but most of my background has kind of been based on an engineering mindset of an individual that's moved into operations and supply chain management. Again, taking those principles like from the Toyota production system and implementing them. And and I really like principles, over people that say, hey, well, we have a playbook, because if something changes, that playbook may not function as well. But the principles will still carry forward, so things like concepts like flow, visual management, things like that, they hold true no matter what you're doing or where you're doing it in the world, more so than just having a playbook that I have to go through and check boxes every step of the way. So, hopefully I've got some insights that people will find useful and, of interest.
I love that focus too on principles that have kind of carried you throughout your whole career. Were there any things from early on that you still apply regularly in your work life?
I love walking factory floors. I'd rather walk the factory floor instead of sitting in and looking at a slide deck, because I think, that's reality. That's the story out there. And you can look at all the pages in slides and PowerPoint, but a simple 20, 30-minute walk kind of tells you all you need to know. Let's take, for instance, the maintenance. Maintenance is not sexy in the world, in a business, but if you walk into a maintenance area and that maintenance area isn't well maintained and cleaned and organized, then right away that raises the question, what are you doing with the equipment that's out on the floor? How are you taking care of the capital investment? And that actually holds pretty true. In the restaurant industry, it's usually, you go and you look at the restrooms. And if the restrooms are a mess, that says a lot about the back of the house. And there's a strong correlation there to both of those. But, even just walking through, where is inventory sitting as either WIP or raw materials or finished goods? Those are opportunities that says a lot about how the factory is operating, or what their strategy may be. WIP and large piles of WIP or work in progress, if somebody isn't familiar with that, That could be an indication that the upstream process is overproducing, or the downstream process is having, let's say, a mechanical or quality issue, and they're not consuming it. So that's an opportunity without any slide deck, without any Excel sheet, that somebody should be focusing on.
What are some of those things that you look at in the first 30 days? Take a private equity acquisition example.
Yeah, so number one is trust in God. Everybody else bring data. That is typically something that's usually very lacking. And I think this is also something, even if it's not a turnaround, but I've seen in some founder-owned companies, and we'll say, let's say sub 30 to 50 million. It's not uncommon. But, the data that you would typically want to see or need isn't readily available, So that actually kind of creates a bit of a challenge, because you have to go validate, find it, then validate it, versus having it readily available where you can actually expedite that improvement process or the analysis process. I'm a big believer, the financials kind of drive it. So, there's areas within the financials that, material costs, for manufacturing, it's not uncommon to see material costs up around, 48, 50%. That's the single largest budgetary line item. If they don't have control of that, it can be easy to see why their on-time delivery is poor, their margins on their products. I've seen instances where, the costing was out of control. And I've walked into scenarios where, at one company, 60% of the products we made were at a loss. We wrapped dollar bills around everything we sent out the door. You don't need to be a super operationally focused individual to realize that, hey, that doesn't really work. Eventually that's a problem. You don't need anything fancy. You don't need a massive MRP, an expensive MRP to tell you this. It's really just fundamentals. And I would encourage everybody, start with the financial statement.
Yeah, no, definitely. Are there certain things you would, focus on, or does it just depend on the business?
Again, for manufacturing, I'm always gonna look at, what's in, that cost of goods sold section. Is it materials? Again, if you make a 10% improvement on let's say the direct labor, that's minimal compared to, let's say, a 2% that could be on the material side. So understanding, where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck. With the turnaround, the trick is it's kind of like an emergency room technician, or doctor. You have to stop the hemorrhaging, and in order to get the patient healthy, So don't worry about the splinter, worry about the tourniquet that's sitting on there.
Yeah, good advice. During integration, what are have you seen examples of it going wrong? What does it take to make a good integration work?
Again, I'm going to go back to, having, if you can educate people first. A lot of times they're like, hey, we're gonna smash these companies together, or, one company may be very mature, one company isn't so mature, or, you take a again, I'm going to pick on the founder-led businesses, smaller scale, who may not have MRP system. They're profitable, they're being successful, but they don't have necessarily the access to the data, or, sometimes people, they kind of grow up with the company. And that's great. I'm all about promoting people and growing people. But if those folks didn't get exposure to, let's say, how standard things typically operate, and let's pick on MRP or ERP. The backbone of that hasn't changed since it was first conceived. The structure of calculating, when materials needed and when it should be delivered and when it should be ordered. It hasn't really changed. You can do it with 3x5 cards. You can do it with an Excel sheet. The ERP system makes it easier for you. But if haven't been introduced to those concepts of MRP planning, it's tough to expect people to be successful with it. I use the analogy. It's hard to explain what good looks like to people if they've never seen it.
Yeah.
Somebody that's been in, the same job or the same industry for, 20, 30 years, they've got a lot of experience in that industry. But if they've never seen anything else other than, inside the same four walls. They don't have that concept. So with integrations, that's tough. It was an educational piece, a systems piece, and then I think even just a process piece. Ask folks, hey, do you have a process for this? And if their response is, well, Joe kind of takes care of that, or Sally kind of takes care of that. Okay, that's not really a process. That's tribal knowledge, and it serves a purpose. But that also means that it's somewhat dependent on how Sally or, Tom or whomever are feeling that day. Or if they're even out on PTO, then who does it?
As a business owner potentially selling to private equity, is there any advice you might give someone in those shoes, whether it be mindset or like what it makes a successful sale?
I think for business owners to really get the best value, out of their company, I think that the sellers leave value on the table, to be honest. So you want to think about, 2 to 3 years before you think you're going to exit is the time to really kind of start building those, again, the systems and, the processes, putting that discipline infrastructure in place, getting your financials in order. The PE groups are still going to kind of want to massage it and look at it the way they typically look at it. And do a little research, do some research into who your potential sellers may be. If it's private equity, understand what private equity looks at, how they operate. There's a bit of a sense out there in some ways that people look at private equity as being a dirty word or somebody to stay away from. And it's like everything else. There's firms out there you should actually absolutely stay away from. But there's firms out there that are really good people, really smart people that actually, they want to take your business to that next level. They're not corporate raiders. They want to grow the business. They want to grow the profitability of the business, and as a byproduct, that means that you're going to be hiring more people, getting better systems in place, et cetera. So the majority of private equity is really good folks, smart folks too. So understand what that nuance is, how they think about it. Familiarize yourself with some of their concepts of like EBITDA. If you don't know what EBITDA is and you sell to private equity, you will learn very quick what EBITDA is. They kind of live and die on that. Look at how your cash conversion takes place. How you're managing cash. How you're managing. Your days of sales. Your days of inventory. And again, these are just disciplinary type things. Spend some time and clean up the operation. It's really indicative of. If somebody's taken a business, built it from the ground up and grown it to, $10, $20 million, kudos to you. Kudos to that person. You deserve to get all of the financial benefit out of that. All that sweat equity, time and effort you put into it. Don't let somebody else just walk away with it. So it's not, and again, these aren't things that, are complex or difficult. They just require kind of a little bit of a different shift, maybe less day-to-day, being in the weeds or firefighting, and just kind of carving out some time and being like, look, it's a 2-year journey that I want to position the company for the best sale possible. If you haven't bought any new equipment and you haven't upgraded anything, in several years, you're gonna pay that penalty. And it's not to say go out and buy a bunch of new equipment and say, look, this is what we've got. But again, they want to see that the business, they're not going to have to come in and spend a bunch of, money or put a bunch more money into the business to capitalize it better for growth. Show that it's already on that progression and, reach out. I would encourage, to develop those relationships early with some of those PE firms and have some of those discussions. And not every PE firm is going to be right for you. Whether it's just, personal differences or different industries. There are firms that will, they'll buy from you because it's a great price. But I would say, look to sell somebody who's kind of got experience in your sector. They'll appreciate what you're doing. They'll understand any nuances better than somebody that's agnostic. And if you're going to be, selling to a strategic, I think it kind of comes back down to the same thing. have your house in order, have the discipline, have the processes in place. It's never going to hurt you.
Definitely. Well said. Those foundational principles will, dramatically increase the value you're able to command,
Exactly.
the multiple EBITDA you're able to command when you go to sell.
Yeah. Don't wake up one day on a Monday and be like, hey, we're gonna go sell, and you haven't done anything really with the business for a year or two. It's going to impact that multiple pretty easy, pretty quick.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a lot of good tips you said too around finding the right buyer, planning
Yes.
ahead. I wanted to pick your brain also about building a right team. I know you've had to kind of go in there and sometimes evaluate the existing leadership, right, and some of those turnarounds. What does great talent look like in a high pressure operational environment like that?
That's a really good question. I want to say, those folks that have good work ethic, and again, I take the approach, most people come to work because they want to do a good job. They care about what they're doing. Turnarounds are actually, unfortunately, some of those good people, suffer because of it, because, you may have to make some reductions and headcount changes just because you want to reduce the break-even point to make the business healthy. But what you really want to look for is those people that really care about the business. And whenever I've gone into a company, I've always asked, like who's the biggest complainer in the company? Who is the person that's going to bitch and moan about like everything and anything? And I usually get this look like, well, why do you want to go talk to them? And I'm like, because what I found is about 70, 80% of the time, everybody else is kind of shut down. And so they just stop speaking out. That person still cares enough. Now, they may not always speak in the most polite manner or, might be a little rough around the edges, but what they're telling you has merit. What they're saying isn't incorrect. They may just be saying it a little more harshly, a little more brashly, maybe than they could. But they care enough to still speak out. So I firmly believe, and I've seen this from my consulting experiences, most of the answers are already in the company. The people know, people that want to say, hey, well, those folks don't really understand this. The executive team says, hey, the folks on the floor won't really understand that. They understand a lot more than they're giving credit for. They understand that the business is not doing well when they see the fact that some of the customers that used to come through aren't coming through anymore. The volume is down. They see it. They know it. So you really kind of got to get engaged with that. I'm a firm believer, you roll up the sleeves, show them that you're going to do a little sweat equity with them. You're not just there to kind of, kick them in the rear end or punch them in the nose. Turnarounds are as successful as the team you can pull together. Identifying the people that have specific experience. Not everybody is always in the job that they're best suited for. Maybe they got pushed over somewhere and they've been in a position for like a year or 2 years because they didn't have anybody else and they had been there the longest and they were familiar with it and they could kind of learn it. But they may just be fumbling their way through it. So how do you take that person and put them back where they're going to be a superstar and let them be successful? The biggest turnaround I did, I walked in, on day one and there was 103 people. Day 45. We were down to 51 people.
Wow.
Right. So it was dramatic. I did all of the layoffs myself because I think you got to take the ownership of it. Don't let people do your dirty work. And immediately that afternoon, I pulled every remaining employee together and I said, look, this is why we did it. These aren't all bad people, but we have to do this for the business to survive. And it's tough, right? You have to look at a lot of people that's going to impact their lives. But sometimes a doctor has to amputate a limb to save the patient. Right. And that's kind of how I kind of keep it straight. And I kind of explained out the vision. So you can't just do the cuts. You got to be able to then immediately pivot and say, this is where we want to go. Here's the vision. Here's the strategy. You folks are part of it. I've been involved in 4 turnarounds. But I had a great team in each of those turnarounds of folks that lined up and did some of the hard work as well. In that particular one, we ended up growing up 36% year over year on revenue, which is pretty substantial. We added
with
two people.
half the workforce.
Yeah, we added two people. One of them was much smarter than me. I needed an engineer, much smarter than me. I don't want to be the smartest person in the room, or that's a failure. We were growing at triple digits on the bottom line, which kind of shows how the business had been underperforming. It had been neglected. And, this was a business that in 17 years, it had just been run as a cost center and never made a profit. And so, that first 6 months, we actually finished out the fiscal year. And I think we made a profit of about $385. But you know what? 17 years of loss, 1 year making 300, some odd dollars, that's a win. And that's a win for the team. You celebrate that.
I love your perspective on things. I think it's really valuable the turnaround perspective gives a lot of practical insights for companies that are just, struggling to grow as well.
It forces you to get into the weeds sometimes. And it forces you to learn a lot. I don't necessarily encourage people to say, hey, just go look for turnarounds, right? Because it's tough. You better be willing to put in the hours, because you have a finite window. And some of these turnarounds I've walked into, I've had a mandate of, do a review and make a determination whether you're gonna wind it down or you're gonna make a go for it. And if you're gonna make a go for it, what's your plan? So I've never actually wound anything completely down. I've always made a go of it. I give a lot of credit to some of the folks because I don't necessarily know the industry. I don't know the customers. But again, I understand the principles and the elements that we need to go change or fix.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, another major theme of this show is implementing AI and technology for growth and scaling. I've kind of a twofold question here for you. How are you personally leveraging AI? And also, how do you see it affecting your industry? I
have this mixed emotion with AI. On one hand, it's a great tool. I think Notebook LM is super useful. I would encourage everybody to check it out and even use it for setting up internal training programs on topics. It's a great tool where you can dump in your resources, and now you've got a resource for supply chain for people, or a resource for industrial engineering for people, and for minimal cost. So in many ways, it's a great tool. The challenge I have with AI is I hear people saying, hey, we want AI and we want more AI, and yet they can't clearly enunciate what the problem they're trying to solve is, right? If you're just going to chase it, and you don't really know the problem you're trying to solve, AI may give you a bad answer faster, so there's a real risk there. I found out over this year when I got my summary from ChatGPT, I was like one of the top 3 or first 3% of people to really utilize it. I still don't think I'm any smarter with it in many ways, but for me, it's a simplifier, right? I've built workflows. I've kind of delved into that, just from my engineering mindset. I kind of like understanding that a little deeper. But I still think for businesses, the challenge is going to be like, what problems are we trying to solve? I think there's a lot of opportunity to leverage it in the supply chain world, especially as it looks at demand forecasts and demand planning. Great tools, you can dump those data sets in, let it kind of do the number crunching for you, especially if you've got let's say more of a basic MRP system and not something like an Oracle or an SAP that might have that already embedded into it. So, without going out and having to invest, millions of dollars on a new MRP, you can leverage the AI for that. I think, proposals and quotations, I think those are perfect areas where I think it's going to grow. But again, I think there needs to be that educational process. And I've seen this, right? I've seen people kind of just go in there to kind of use it just as a chat bot and not really build the tools or, the markdowns that they can utilize and upload every time for consistency. AI will always give you a response. It will always give you an answer. But for business, consistency sometimes is the best answer. If you want to use it to generate a slide deck, but every slide deck looks different, all the charts are always different every month, it's tough to get that constant, that continuity. So you have to do a little due diligence. You have to train it. You have to educate it, garbage in, garbage out. So again, the old computer principles don't change. Reviewing documents, reviewing contracts, I think it's great. I still think you need to have somebody kind of review it. But again, I think right now at the stage where AI is, it's still about education and using it to educate yourself more than just trusting what it puts out. I've gotten spreadsheets out and I'm like, well, that math just doesn't look right. And I have to go in and dig into it. And when I fix it, I go back, I make sure I follow back up and say, hey, this is not right for this reason. Can you validate it, or am I wrong? It's a growing thing, it's not going to go away. So people that want to bury their head in the sand, I think, you do it at your own peril. I think it's only going to become more connected into, whether it's warehouse management systems, MRP. I think it's great for HR. It's a great HR tool. To help generate reviews and you can upload those reviews, over periods of time and see trends in folks, trends in supervisors, how well people do. Big believer, but also cautious.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. A lot of good insights there. You definitely got to train it, it's like almost like an employee.
Don't hop on the newest system just because somebody came out AI. Right, you're better working within 2 or 3 consistently. They learn your voice, they learn how you look at things, how you want to do things. And I reference markdown documents, which are kind of the instruction sheets you can kind of use. But that, ChatGPT will look at that markdown sheet and interpret it differently than Claude or Perplexity. So it's good, and it gets that framework, those guardrails, but there's still going to be nuances and differences.
Yeah. What do you typically include on a markdown document?
I actually create my markdown sheets helping, with the AI. So once I kind of have what I want, I kind of go through that and say, how would you replicate this, even to things such as color, style, tone. There's some really great references out there, but again, if you use ChatGPT a lot, then work within ChatGPT to give you that markdown. So the next time I want to have this topic or this conversation, I can just upload that sheet. Markdown sheets are actually very, very lightweight. So I would actually encourage anybody to, don't be uploading the PDFs, upload them, take a PDF, change it to a markdown sheet and upload it. It somehow seems to read it better, easier in many ways. It's cleaner. It's cleaner for the software.
Yeah. No, that's really good advice. Giving it something that will allow it to generate a consistent outcome, I think, is really critical.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's going to do what it thinks it's going to have to fill in the blanks, and you don't want to sit there and write out, a 3-page prompt every time you go to do it. So that becomes the instruction set on how to handle that discussion or that next series of prompts.
Yeah. Oh, great. Really good, useful tip there. I have one final question for you. If you could give one practical tip for business owners who want to tighten their operations and increase their company's value right now, what would it be?
Take a walk. I don't mean to, knock any business owners, because I know there's a lot that are fundamentally in the business every day. But sometimes it's easier to get caught up in the firefighting to where you kind of step away the heart of the operation. And that walk could be into the engineering department, the supply chain group. Again, as a business owner, which let's say if you're the CEO, think of it as an inverted pyramid. Your job is to make sure the people that report to you have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to be successful. So you're kind of the bull in the china shop. You're the person that's going to knock down those barriers for them. And just, take a walk, kind of take yourself out of like, this is my baby. How would a third party look at it? And again, if you're going to look to sell, I would encourage to start having those conversations sooner rather than later. Just a conversation with a PE group doesn't mean you have to sell, but get the nuance that they would be looking for, right? I don't think anybody would turn you down. I think they'd be more than happy to sit there and say, hey, let's have that conversation. And when the time's right, give us a ring.
Yeah, well said. Wow. Great advice this episode. Wayne, thank you so much for all your insight. Where can listeners find you, some of your content? I know you post a lot on LinkedIn.
Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I also do a Substack where in some cases, I do longer form content, and that's at the operational edge. So, my bio's on there as well. So a lot of the stuff I'll do on LinkedIn, I'll also reference a link to that. So LinkedIn is probably the easiest, but if you're not a big LinkedIn fan, then there's Substack.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll leave that in the show notes. Thanks so much for your time today, Wayne. It's great talking to you.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it thoroughly.
Exit algorithms. Scale smarter. Sell stronger.